My topic is social character and social unconscious, Erich Fromm's discovery and the problems of today. But as a representative of Russia, I'll look at the problem from the point of view of my generation, both Soviet and Russian. In the Soviet Union, Fromm's works became popular in the 1960s. I got acquainted with them in the late 1960s. His books were not translated at that time, and we read them in English at the library. Although Fromm was well known as neo-Freudian psychoanalyst, we considered him a social thinker first of all. He attracted our attention by his elaboration of the socio-psychological mechanisms of modern society in Marx's spirit. His interpretation of Marx's concept of man was in the foreground. At that time, Marx was officially regarded in our country as a political economist who had worked out the revolutionary theory of overthrowing capitalism. Marx's concept of man was in the background. According to Fromm, Marx's teaching of man in connection with society was of paramount importance. So Fromm followed Marx and regarded person as a social product. He developed the concept of social character as an intermediary between the economic basis and the ideological superstructure. At the same time, Fromm...
Can you speak up a little bit, or we can't hear you well?
Louder.
All right, I'll try to do it.
You can stand up. I think
yes.
it's better to be...
You suppose?
Yes, I suppose that we can better listen
But
if you stand.
I suppose that nobody can see me. I'm so small. It's not... Well, according to Fromm, Marx's teaching of man in connection with society was of paramount importance. So Fromm followed Marx and regarded person as a social product. He developed the concept of social character as an intermediary between the economic basis and the ideological superstructure. At the same time, Fromm drew a reader's attention to the humanistic aspect of Marx's theory. It was very attractive. I own Fromm's influence upon myself. It doesn't mean that I agree with Fromm in full. I find contradictory Fromm's teaching on human nature as potentially inherent in everybody. It does not couple with the concept of social character, in my view. But I admit that, dialectically speaking, contradiction is a source of development, and my subsequent intellectual development was under the influence of this contradiction on the one hand, and the achievements of Fromm's social and socio-psychological thoughts on the other. Fromm's works promoted to review what seemed well known. His ideas gave an opportunity to analyze the changing world. At the same time, his ideas were rather flexible to be adjusted to the new circumstances. First of all, they promoted to review ideological postulates in humanistic mood. Although Fromm criticized sharply the Soviet policy and ideology, his criticism was perceived as more just than everybody else because, firstly, he criticized the United States policy and ideology as severe as the Soviet, and secondly, his criticism concerning our country coincided to a considerable extent with our own. In spite of the widespread opinion that the Soviet frame of mind was ideologically unified, the public mood was rather critical to the effects of the Soviet style of life, and discussions on the social and human problems were usual. It does not mean that critical attitude to some aspects of our life turned us into enemies of the Soviet system. The purpose of our criticism was to improve the situation, developing such principles of the Soviet system as social justice, social security, equal rights for everybody to get higher education and to get a job. Reading Fromm's books, we saw that he was our companion. He stuck the socialist principles and objected their violation. He was convinced of their advantages in comparison with those of bourgeois. Although our points of view on the ways of how to improve the world situation were different, his position was instructive to us, especially his interpretation of ideology as false consciousness in Marx's spirit. We knew this Marxist formula, of course, but it was difficult to realize that there was a gap between the socialist principles declared and the real Soviet ideology. At the same time, we couldn't agree with our ideological opponents that we should replace the Soviet ideology with the ideology of liberalism. We recognized that the opposite ideology didn't fit for our country. We insisted on strengthening of the socialist principles. Fromm's elaboration of this question helped us to understand that we confused sometimes the actual ideological system, whatever starting points it had had, with real life reflected at the system to some extent. Thanks to Fromm, we realized that we had to differentiate between the official ideological system as a sort of false consciousness and the set of ideas as an expression of the peculiarity of a society. In the first case, we deal with the consciousness of the elites who consider, the quotation, their way of organization and the values that are implied in it as being the best interests of man. Quotation closed, as Fromm defined it in Beyond the Chains of Illusion. In the second case, we deal with the manifestation of real spiritual and intellectual social life common to the majority of the nation. Fromm showed that when two opposite ideological systems encountered, no one of these systems could be fully correct. Ideologists of each side were sure that their premises were quite true, while the opposite premises were absolutely wrong. Trying to prove its case, each side distorts the facts and words. Under such circumstances, mutual understanding is impossible. Following Marx's tradition, Fromm called to reject ideologies at all. He preferred Marx's radical point of view, that is, to go to the roots of human being, to become really humane. At the same time, he showed that it was impossible while this social alienation took place. Nevertheless, he did all his best to improve the situation. From this point of view, he criticized the American democracy. He demonstrated that modern democracy turned into a part of official ideology and degenerated into a pure form lost of human content. Fromm was not the first thinker in European tradition who evaluated negatively this form of state. Oswald Spengler, for example, regarded democracy as a feature of so-called civilization, that is, the decay of culture, according to his view. Spengler showed that the democracy of the 20th century meant the total equalization of money with political power, despite of what democracy had meant at its origin. Modern democracy, as Spengler affirmed, destroys itself with the help of money. I suppose that analyzing the situation in the world after the Second World War, Fromm took Spengler's conclusions into account. In his book, The Sane Society, he stresses that, quotation, the functioning of the political machinery in a democratic country is not essentially different from the procedure of the commodity market, quotation marks, and that the professional politicians use the method which looks like the method of high-pressure advertising. No wonder that his estimation of such feature of democracy as universal suffrage is far from positive. He writes in The Sane Society, quotation, under these circumstances, universal suffrage becomes a fetish. These passages were written in the middle of the previous century. Now one can make sure that democracy has become a fetish, or I'd better say an idée fixe, just as the idea of human rights. I spoke about it 2 years ago in Mexico. Now, I'd like to stress that this transformation of democracy took place because of the socially conditioned filter as a mechanism of social unconscious, enumerated by Fromm in Beyond the Chains of Illusion. The idea of democracy, just as the idea of human rights, was ideologically transformed into the frame for real life. Now, both frames are recognized as preferable to real life. Life manifestations must fit these frames to be recognized real or true. Otherwise, they must be fitted in these frames by all means. This situation will probably remain till an alienated society exists, until the elite of globalizing world regards its own interests as the best interests of the humanity. So we can ascertain that Fromm warned us against modern democracy as a manifestation of an alienated society. Unfortunately, during the so-called perestroika, its reconstruction, Soviet authorities yielded the temptation to look Democrats and liberals. Following the advices of the American counselors, Soviet and then Russian leaders tried to establish democratic form of government by placing national resources at their supporters' disposal. The vital problems of the country were ignored. As a result, we had rather destruction of our social life than reconstruction. New social institutions alien to our society were established, but they don't function productively. To smooth out the social mechanism, our authorities resorted to consumerism. Fromm warned us against it beforehand. He pointed out the negative consequences of this phenomenon, especially its destructive impact on the human psyche. He criticized the Soviet Union of the 1960s as a have state based on the possession principle. Fromm considered this principle bourgeois and reproached the Soviet government for a deviation of Marxism. I fully agree with his estimation of consumerism, but I think Fromm overestimated an introduction of the have principle into the Soviet life that time. Unfortunately, the Soviet leaders didn't take into consideration Fromm's warning. During the so-called perestroika, the basis of consumers' society was established. After the Soviet Union destruction, this tendency was strengthened as a feature of the market orientation. The corresponding type of social character was applied in Russian society together with so-called free market. So we stepped back from the declared socialist principles to bourgeois ones. Instead of developing more progressive principles that were not developed properly, we stepped back to the principles of the past, but well developed in capitalist countries. This retreat was officially explained by the fact that Russia was technologically retarded and technological development needed the other attitude to the means of production and the other state of the productive forces. People, as a new productive force, had to be equipped with computers and to be able to use them. The socio-psychological problems arise. What kind of social character corresponds with computerizing world, and does this type of social character promote humanization of the world? These are problems of nowadays. There are no ready answers in Fromm's books, but we have some Fromm's reflections on the theme to use them as a starting point. Fromm was worried about the principle of the modern technological system, that everything must be done if technologically can be done. What kind of results will follow? It's not a problem for technocrats, even if the humanity is annihilated. In spite of the technocratic frame of mind, Fromm resisted. In spite of the technocratic frame of mind, Fromm insisted that technology should be placed at the service of human beings. Both economic and technological development must be the means of human development. Nowadays, when computers are almost world spread, this problem is more urgent than in the late 1960s, when Fromm wrote The Revolution of Hope. Does modern person serve a computer, or a computer must be in person service? Fromm would answer in humanistic way that a computer must help people to develop themselves in contact with other people. In fact, the situation is more complicated. We encounter with the problem of a new social character corresponding to the computer reality. I propose to call this type of social character information character. A person of this character is capable to perceive, to process, and to send information without digesting it, as if a person is not a subject of the process, but a means of transmission. It means that subjectivity is lacking, and social alienation is deepened in globalization. According to Dr. Fromm's conception, modern social character can be called me orientation, and it is characterized by kaleidoscopic perception and thinking. A person of such character needs permanent outer stimulation and outer integrators. This description confirms that subjectivity is lost nowadays. In conclusion, Fromm's concepts of social character and social unconscious are still valid and give an opportunity to use them while analyzing modern social and cultural changes. Thank you.